November 14th, 1945, 22 hours, U.S. Naval Base, Yokosuka, occupied Japan. The air in the interrogation room tasted of stale Lucky Strikes and damp wool. Under the cone of a single, low-wattage desk lamp, the dust motes danced violently, agitated by the rhythmic, percussive clack-clack ding of a Remington typewriter. Keiko Tanaka, former civilian auxiliary for the Imperial Japanese Navy, sat on a wooden stool, her hands trembling in her lap. She did not look at the face in the shadows. She looked at the desk. A manila folder lay there, thick with the condensed reality of her war. On its cover, a red stamp, faded now but visible, read, "Confidential." "Name of unit commander?" the voice asked. It wasn't a shout. It was a bore, a monotone drawl of a Nisei interpreter who sounded like he wanted to go home. Keiko's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had been told the Americans were devils who feasted on marrow. She expected the bamboo slivers, the water hose. Instead, she got a bored corporal and a form with carbon paper. "Commander, Sato," she whispered, waiting for the blow. The typewriter keys struck the paper. Clack, clack, like gunshots in a canyon. The interrogator slid a piece of paper across the scarred wood. "Sign here," the interpreter said. "It says you weren't forced to say that." Keiko stared at the English text, then the Japanese translation. No coercion. The concept was so alien, so surgically clean compared to the blood-soaked expectations of her indoctrination, that she felt a vertigo worse than the bombing raids. 6 weeks earlier, Uraga Repatriation Center. If you enjoy deep dives into historical psychology, please consider subscribing and commenting where you are listening from. The mud at the Uraga Repatriation Center was not simply earth and water. It was a slur of ash, human waste, and the dissolving fabric of a fallen empire. It sucked at Keiko Tanaka's ankles, threatening to pull the oversized Mampe pantaloons right off her hips. She kept her head down. That was the first rule of survival she had drafted for herself since the surrender broadcast. Be invisible. Be nobody. Around her, thousands of displaced civilians and demobilized soldiers moved like a single, sluggish organism. The air reeked of unwashed bodies and the acrid smoke of cooking fires fed by debris. Keiko clutched her canvas rucksack to her chest. Inside, hidden wrapped in a dirty undershirt, was her Imperial Japanese Navy identification booklet. She should have burned it. She knew she should have burned it, but burning it felt like erasing the last 3 years of her existence, the only years where she had mattered. "Line up. Rows of 5. The command came from a Japanese policeman, his uniform ragged, his authority borrowed entirely from the tall, gum-chewing American MPs standing behind him. Keiko shuffled into position, wedging herself between an elderly woman carrying a cage with no bird and a coughing teenage boy. She was 23, but in the reflection of a puddle, she looked 40. Her hands, once deft enough to calibrate the delicate vacuum tubes of a Type 3 radar set, were cracked and blackened with grime. An American Jeep, a Willys MB with a white star stenciled on the hood, crawled through the mud, parting the crowd. The engine growled, a mechanical predator. An officer in the passenger seat stood up, holding a clipboard. He didn't look at their faces. He looked at his list. "Communications auxiliaries," the interpreter shouted, his voice amplified by a crackling bullhorn. "Personnel attached to Yokosuka Naval District. Signals, radar, encryption." Keiko stopped breathing. The cold October wind bit through her thin cotton shirt, but she felt a flush of absolute heat rise up her neck. They know. The rumors whispered in the latrine lines had been specific. "The Americans execute the specialists first," the old women said. "They think the radar operators called down the kamikaze. They will take you to the caves and burn you." "Tanaka, Keiko," the interpreter's voice cut through the gray noise. "Unit 204. The elderly woman next to her flinched and stepped away, creating a small, damning circle of empty space around Keiko. The isolation was instant. The herd had identified the sick animal and was severing the limb to save itself. Keiko looked up. The American officer on the jeep was pointing a gloved finger directly at her. He didn't look angry. He looked efficient. "Step forward," the interpreter commanded. Keiko's legs moved on their own, betrayed by years of military discipline. She stepped out of the anonymity of the crowd and into the crosshairs of the victors. The holding area was not a prison cell, but a surplus U.S. Army general purpose tent, smelling violently of mildew and heated rubber. The air inside was stagnant, trapped by the heavy olive drab canvas that glowed faintly from the afternoon sun beating down outside. Keiko sat on a folding wooden crate, her knees pulled tight to her chest. There were 4 other women in the tent. None of them spoke. They were a tableau of the defeated, a typist from the Naval Ministry who was weeping silently into her hands, and 2 older women who looked like switchboard operators, staring blankly at the dirt floor. A young American GI, his helmet strap unbuckled, ducked through the flap. He didn't carry a rifle, but a cardboard box. He dropped it in the center of the circle with a heavy thud and left without a word. The box sat there, like an unexploded bomb. Keiko leaned forward. It was open. Inside were small, olive-drab tins and packets wrapped in wax paper. K-rations. She had seen diagrams of them in civil defense pamphlets. The pamphlets warned that the Americans laced their food with sterilization agents or slow-acting toxins to thin the Japanese population. "Don't touch it," the typist whispered, her voice cracking. "It's the poison. They want us to do it ourselves so they don't waste bullets." Keiko's stomach cramped, a violent reminder that she hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. The wax paper wrappers promised calories, processed cheese, biscuits, sugar. Her biological imperative to survive screamed against her ideological conditioning to die with honor. She stared at a tin labeled cheese, processed, American. The font was blocky, industrial, confident. From outside, a low, constant thrumming vibration penetrated the soles of her shoes. Generators, massive, diesel-fed electric generators. The Americans had enough fuel to power lights in the middle of the day, while Tokyo had been cooking with sawdust briquettes for months. The sheer logistical arrogance of the sound was more demoralizing than any beating. Suddenly, the tent flap opened again. Keiko flinched, bracing for the MP. Instead, she saw through the opening to the adjacent tent, the interrogation section. A Japanese naval officer, a lieutenant commander by his insignia, was being led out. Keiko recognized the rank. A man of that stature would surely have been tortured for the location of submarine pens. She watched, holding her breath, waiting to see blood, bruises, or a broken gate. The officer walked steadily. He paused, lit a cigarette with a trembling hand, and exhaled a long plume of smoke. He looked drained, his posture slumped in defeat, but he was physically whole. No missing fingernails, no swelling. He looked like a man who had just finished a long, difficult exam. The flap fell back into place, cutting off the view. Keiko sat back, her mind reeling. Why is he whole? The cognitive dissonance made her dizzy. If they weren't breaking bodies, what were they doing in there? The silence of the tent suddenly felt heavier, charged with a threat she couldn't calculate. The flap opened a 3rd time. This soldier was different. He was short, with the face of a Japanese man, but the uniform and swagger of an American, a Nisei. "Tanaka," he said, mispronouncing the intonation of her name with a flat Californian accent. "You're up. Bring your gear." The walk to the administrative sector was a journey through a world that shouldn't have existed. Keiko followed 2 paces behind the Nisei interpreter, her boots scuffing against gravel that had been freshly laid over the bomb-cratered road. Everywhere she looked, she saw machines. Not the desperate, cobbled-together retrofits she was used to seeing in the final months of the war, but sleek, mass-produced steel monsters. A convoy of GMC CCKW2 1-2-ton trucks, deuce and a halfs, rumbled past them. They were piled high with wooden crates, tires, and jerry cans. The smell was overwhelming. A rich, thick perfume of unburnt diesel and high-octane gasoline that made her lightheaded. Japan had been digging up pine roots to distill fuel oil, yet these men burned petrol as if it were water. She kept her eyes fixed on the interpreter's back, trying to block out the sights, but the sensory assault was inescapable. She passed a group of GIs lounging on a loading dock. They were big men, their uniforms clean and well-fitted. They were smoking cigarettes, Chesterfields, the packet visible in a breast pocket, and laughing. Their laughter was loud, loose, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the sound of men who knew they had already won long before the Emperor spoke. Keiko felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just hunger. It was a profound, hollowing realization. The propaganda reels had lied. They hadn't been fighting a desperate enemy. They had been throwing pebbles at a glacier. Her foot caught on a loose cobblestone. Weakened by days of rationing, her balance failed. She pitched forward, her hands scraping against the rough gravel as she hit the ground. Before she could scramble up, a shadow fell over her. A large hand, covered in pale hair and grease, reached down. Keiko flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. "Easy there, sister," a deep voice rumbled. The hand didn't strike. It gripped her upper arm, firmly but without malice, and hoisted her to her feet. She opened her eyes. A young American mechanic, wiping his other hand on a rag, looked at her. His face held no hatred, no triumphant sneer, just a mild, bored concern. He looked at her like one might look at a stumbling child. "Watch your step," he said, then turned back to his truck as if she were of no consequence at all. Keiko stood frozen, dust covering her knees. The Nisei interpreter looked back, impatient. "Come on," he said. "Don't keep the lieutenant waiting." She began walking again, but her legs felt different now. The fear of torture had been replaced by something far more confusing. They didn't hate her. To them, she wasn't a monster to be destroyed. She was just something that had fallen down in the street. They reached a low concrete building that had survived the air raids. A sign above the door read, "CIC, authorized personnel only." The interpreter held the door open, and the smell of coffee hit her like a physical wall. The anteroom of the CIC section was warm, heated by a cast-iron stove that glowed in the corner. To Keiko, who had been shivering in the damp coastal wind for weeks, the heat felt narcotic. She sat on a stiff wooden bench, her hands clenched in her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned the color of old ivory. The room did not smell of blood. It smelled of carbon paper, floor wax, and stale tobacco. Across the room, a young American woman in a uniform, a WAC, Keiko realized with a start, sat behind a heavy oak desk. She was typing furiously on a black Remington noiseless typewriter. Clack, clack, ding, clack, clack, ding. The rhythm was hypnotic, a mechanical heartbeat of the occupation. Keiko listened for screams. She strained her ears towards the heavy wooden door marked Office 4, expecting to hear the muffled cries of the officer who had gone in before her. She heard nothing but the murmur of voices, low and indistinguishable, broken occasionally by a cough or the scrape of a chair leg against wood. The silence was worse than the screaming would have been. Screaming, she understood. Screaming meant war. This quiet, efficient bureaucracy was a terrifying void. The WAC stopped typing. She pulled the sheet of paper from the roller with a sharp zip, then looked up. Her eyes landed on Keiko. Keiko froze, her breath hitching. The American woman stood up. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She walked over to a side table where a large metal urn sat, sputtering steam. She picked up a chipped white enamel mug, turned the spigot, and filled it with a dark, steaming liquid. She added 2 heaping spoons of white powder from a tin, sugar, real sugar, and stirred it with a pencil. She walked across the room and held the mug out to Keiko. "Here," the woman said. Her tone was indifferent, not kind, but not cruel. "You look like you're going to pass out." Keiko stared at the mug. The steam carried the scent of roasted beans, rich and earthy. It was a smell from another life, from before the firebombs, before the hunger. "Take it," the Nisei interpreter grunted from his corner, not looking up from a magazine. "It's just coffee." Keiko's trembling hands reached out and took the mug. The heat radiated through her ceramic cold palms. She raised it to her lips and took a small sip. The taste was shocking. It was intensely sweet, milky, and strong. It didn't taste like the parched soy water they had been drinking for 2 years. It tasted like wealth. It tasted like victory. A tear leaked from Keiko's eye, tracking through the dirt on her cheek. She wiped it away furiously. "They are not killing me," she realized with a sudden, crushing clarity. "They are just working." She was not a martyr in a grand tragedy. She was a file number waiting to be processed. The realization made her feel incredibly small, but for the first time in months, she did not feel dead. The heavy wooden door clicked open. "Tanaka," a voice called out from the inner office. "Send her in." The office was stark, illuminated by a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling wire. It washed the room in a harsh clinical light that left no shadows to hide in. Behind the desk sat a man who looked more like a university professor than a conqueror. He wore a khaki shirt with the collar unbuttoned and no tie. On his collar, the small brass insignia of the Intelligence Corps caught the light. He was clean-shaven, smelling faintly of soap and aftershave, a sharp contrast to the bearded, grime-streaked faces of the Japanese men Keiko had seen in the ruins. "Sit down, Miss Tanaka," the interpreter said, gesturing to the wooden stool in the center of the room. Keiko sat. She kept her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing else. If they hit you, bite your tongue. "My name is Lieutenant Miller," the American said. His voice was soft, almost bored. He didn't look at her. He was reading a file. "You were attached to the 302nd Naval Air Group, specifically the Early Warning Section at Chiba. Is that correct?" Keiko remained silent. She stared at a knot in the wooden desk. To confirm the unit was treason. Miller sighed. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pen, a sleek black Parker 51 with a silver cap. He uncapped it with a smooth metallic click that sounded impossibly loud in the small room. "Miss Tanaka, we are not here to play games," Miller said. He opened a large folder on his desk and spun it around so it faced her. It was a map, an aerial reconnaissance photograph of the Boso Peninsula, overlaid with a grid of red grease pencil marks. Keiko's breath caught in her throat. It was her station. The resolution was terrifyingly clear. She could see the camouflaged barracks, the path to the latrines, and the distinct spiderweb shadow of the Type 3 Mark I radar antenna. A red circle had been drawn around the operations bunker, where she had spent the last year of her life. "We bombed the airfield 3 miles north on July 10th, Miller said, tapping the map with the tip of his Parker. "We left your station alone. Do you know why?" Keiko looked up, her resolve fracturing. "Why?" she whispered, forgetting the interpreter. "Because we were listening to you," Miller said, his eyes finally locking onto hers. They were gray and unreadable. We were tracking your signals to calibrate our own jamming frequencies. You were more useful to us alive. The room seemed to tilt. The pride she had held onto, the belief that she was a warrior defending the homeland, evaporated. She hadn't been a defender. She had been a tool for the enemy's calibration. The shame was hotter than any iron brand. We know where you were, Miller said, closing the folder. Now I need to know about the equipment, specifically the magnetron calibration modifications made in August. He picked up his pen again, poised to write. Tell me about the frequencies, Keiko. Keiko stared at the blank sheet of paper Miller had pushed across the desk. Her hand hovered over the pencil. To draw the schematic was to give them the mind of the machine. The oscillator, Miller prompted, leaning forward. We know the Type 3 Mark I used a magnetron copied from the British cavity design, but the cooling system failed above 3,000 megacycles. How did you stabilize it? The interpreter, a young man from California who clearly knew more about farming than physics, stumbled over the translation. He asks, how did you keep the radio box from getting too hot when the numbers went high? Keiko winced. The imprecision was physically painful to her. It was an insult to the delicate. Engineering she had spent sleepless nights monitoring. It wasn't the heat, she said in Japanese, her voice quiet but firm. It was the frequency drift. The interpreter looked confused. He turned to Miller. She says, it wasn't the heat. Miller's eyes narrowed with interest. Ask her about the wavelength. Was it 10 meters? The interpreter nodded and turned to Keiko. Was the wave 10 meters long? No, Keiko snapped, the technician in her overriding the prisoner. She grabbed the pencil. 10 centimeters. If it were 10 meters, the resolution would be useless for tracking individual bombers. It was a microwave system. She began to sketch. Her strokes were sure and rapid. She drew the dipole antenna, the parabolic reflector, and the distinct shape of the magnetron block. For the first time in hours, her hand stopped trembling. The language of physics was universal. It had no nationality. It did not bow to the emperor, and it did not surrender to the Americans. It simply was. We used a water jacket cooling system, Keiko explained, pointing to her drawing, speaking directly to Miller now, ignoring the interpreter. She tapped the paper. Here, the copper lines. But the seals leaked, always leaked. Miller nodded slowly, watching her draw. He wasn't looking at her as a conquest anymore, or even as a woman. He was looking at her as a peer. And the blind spots? He asked. The low-altitude clutter? Sea return, Keiko answered immediately. Below 500 feet, the waves confused the signal. We couldn't distinguish a B-29 from a fishing boat. She stopped. The pencil froze on the paper. She realized what she had done. She had just engaged in a professional symposium with the enemy who had burned her cities. She looked up at Miller, expecting to see mockery. Instead, she saw only professional satisfaction. He picked up the drawing and examined it like a rare artifact. Thank you, Miller said. That matches our analysis. He opened a drawer and pulled out a new file, a thin, single sheet of paper. The interrogation was over. The technical extraction was complete. Now came the administrative finality. You're done, Keiko, Miller said, his voice dropping back to a bureaucratic drone. Now we just need to make it official. The air in the interrogation room had settled, heavy with the smell of stale Lucky Strikes and damp wool. Under the cone of the single, low-wattage desk lamp, dust motes danced violently, agitated by the rhythmic, percussive clack-clack ding of the typewriter. Miller was typing. He used 2 fingers, striking the keys with a brute, mechanical efficiency. Keiko watched the metal arms hammer against the ribbon, imprinting her betrayal onto the official record. She sat on the wooden stool, her hands trembling in her lap. The technical fugue state of the previous hour had evaporated, leaving her cold and exposed. She looked at the desk. A manila folder lay there, thick, with the condensed reality of her war. Miller ripped the page from the roller. He sandwiched it between a sheet of carbon paper and a copy, then slid the stack across the scarred wood toward her. "Read it," Miller said. He picked up his cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange. The Nisei interpreter leaned in. "It's a standard form. Read the top paragraph." Keiko stared at the English text, then at the Japanese translation typed awkwardly below it. The words swam before her tired eyes. "I, Keiko Tanaka, make this statement of my own free will. No threats or promises of immunity have been made to me." "No coercion," the interpreter clarified, tapping the line with a dirty fingernail. "It means we didn't force you. We didn't hurt you. You told us this because it is the truth." Keiko felt a vertigo worse than the bombing raids. No coercion. The concept was alien. In the Imperial Navy, truth was what the commander ordered it to be. Duty was enforced by the strike of a bamboo sword or the shame of peer pressure. But here, in this enemy room, the truth was a transaction, a legal agreement. She looked at Miller. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't enjoying her defeat. He was just a man doing a job, wanting to file this paper so he could go to the mess hall and eat dinner. The banality of it shattered the last of her fear. The Americans were not demons. They were bureaucrats with better supply lines. "Sign here," Miller said, offering the Parker 51. Keiko took the pen. It felt heavy, balanced, and warm from his hand. She looked at the blank line above the word deponent. If she signed, she acknowledged that the empire was truly gone. If she signed, she became a citizen of this new defeated reality. She pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed smoothly, black and permanent. She wrote her name, Keiko Tanaka. Miller took the paper back. He checked the signature, nodded, and picked up a heavy rubber stamp. He pressed it into a red ink pad, then brought it down on the folder with a final, authoritative thump. "Confidential." "You're free to go, Miss Tanaka," Miller said, not looking up. "The MP at the door will give you your release slip." Keiko stepped out of the administrative building and into the cold twilight. The air tasted different now, less like fear and more like the sea. In her hand, she clutched a half-sheet of mimeographed paper. It was a simple form, stamped with the same red ink that had marked her file. "Cleared for release. U.S. Navy Provost Marshal." It was a flimsy thing, yet it held more power than any prayer she had offered at the Yasukuni Shrine. It was permission to exist. The Nisei interpreter walked her to the perimeter gate. He didn't speak, and Keiko was grateful for the silence. There was nothing left to say. The transaction was complete. She had given them her knowledge, and they had given her back her life. As they reached the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, the guard duty had changed. A new MP checked her paper, shone a flashlight in her face for a brief second, and then nodded. He swung the heavy gate open. The hinges groaned, a sound of finality. Keiko stepped through. Behind her lay the occupation, the hum of generators, the smell of coffee and diesel, the bright, confident electric lights of the victors. Ahead of her lay Japan. The Yokosuka skyline was a jagged silhouette against a purple bruise of a sky. There were no lights, only the smoldering orange glow of cooking fires in the shanty towns that had sprung up in the ruins of the factories. The wind blew ash across the road, swirling around her boots. She paused, looking down at her hands. They were still stained with ink from the Parker pen. A strange thought occurred to her. She was not the same woman who had walked into that camp. That woman had been a servant of the Empire, ready to die for a code that had already abandoned her. The woman standing here now was a collaborator, a traitor by the old laws, but a survivor by the new ones. She put the release slip into her pocket, right next to the empty space where her Navy ID used to be. Keiko took a breath. It smelled of charred wood and salt water. It was the smell of a world that had burned down, waiting for someone to build something new from the ashes. She adjusted her rucksack, fixed her eyes on the darkened road ahead, and began to walk. The war was over. Her life had just begun.